how can we get employees and associates to really buy into having this team first mindset as opposed to furthering their own interests?
Yeah. I mean, I think part of it is recognizing these two things don't have to be in conflict. So when we say, or when I talk about ownership, I say the definition to me of ownership is that I'm willing to put the team's interests ahead of my own personal interests. It's not necessarily at the expense of my personal interests. It's just recognizing that hopefully they're aligned, right? If I want to do well in my career, then that means doing well for the client, for example. But it also means that this isn't just about avoiding the partner's wrath. So if a partner is a micromanager, if the partner really focuses on, hey, this period is italicized and this one isn't. Now, I'm not saying we don't want to catch errors. We do want to catch errors. But if the way that you approach your management is to always be focusing on that and on this idiosyncratic version of legal work, as opposed to helping someone realize that, look, there are lots of ways to do something. Here's why I think the direction you're going isn't as successful. Here's a way I think could be better, and talking it out. If you take a collaborative approach, okay, less idiosyncratic, more collaborative, more talking about the why behind my feedback on your brief or on your deal papers, whatever it is. If I take that collaborative approach, I'm going to encourage people to think about whatever the best way is, the true best way, not the way that gets them to avoid me yelling at them or me sending back a bunch of red lines, right? So it becomes less about the ego of the partner or the senior associate that you're trying to satisfy and more about the true client's interests. So that to me is ownership in the making. That's half of it anyway. There's a whole nother half of it, which is the willingness to own problems that you didn't necessarily create. And that's a really hard one, I think, for folks to recognize. So the way I talk about this one is saying, look, there are things that are going wrong on your team sometimes. Maybe it's something that's subtle, like, oh, the way we're running our meetings isn't great. You know, they're veering off the agenda, or we don't even have an agenda. Or it could be something more significant, like I think the strategic direction for the client is wrong. Are you going to stay in your lane and say, look, I keep my head down, running meetings isn't my job, deciding client strategy is not my job. If you keep taking that head in the sand mentality, then you're not really owning the client, right? You're not really owning the case. So how do you break people out of that mentality? That's the next step. That's really important.
That was actually going to be my follow-up question, is because when you make a problem sort of, or when you isolate a problem down to a certain person's contribution, then it doesn't lend itself to the team first mentality. So how do you get to, or how do you, when you catch an error, right? Like a whole, I don't know, a big one, call it a big error, right? Like the direction or the strategy for a certain client is just not going to work out and you need to change direction. But the person whose idea or the inception of the idea belonged to one person on the team, how do you sort of make it so that the team owns the error and not just the one person, so that you can sort of cut through that egocentric mentality?
Yeah, there's so many ways to slice this one. I mean, true errors, I would hope most lawyers would feel an ethical obligation if they feel like it's a real error. But I think what you're really getting at is the grayer stuff. Like, I think the strategy is just not a great one. I think we can do better. Those conversations are hard to encourage. The way I would talk about it is to say, hey, folks, if I'm a manager team, let's talk about our strategy. I'll try to encourage the team to talk about it. And what I'm really trying to do in this example is shift the mental model of saying that the manager's job is to have all the answers. So if it's the manager's job to have all the strategic answers and the divine wisdom, then if an associate has a different idea, it must be wrong or less than my idea. So instead, what I try to encourage is like, look, I'll come into me and say, look, I've got an idea here. I think I've got the right attitude, but I want to talk it out. Let's make sure everyone has questions or other ideas, something I'm missing. And if I phrase it as, hey, there's something I may be missing. There's some nuances that you're all in the weeds. Maybe you have some ideas here. And I encourage that conversation. I'm showing vulnerability, right? I'm saying I'm not perfect. And even if most of the time they're deferential because they're still more junior to me and I'm the boss, it'll slowly encourage this different way of looking at it and say, okay, well, I can collaborate. And I do the same thing with associates across work. I say, look, have you all read the rest of the brief produced by so-and-so associate? Have you read your peer's work? Have you provided any comments? And they look around. No, I don't have time for that. So, all right, well, look, making time to review each other's work is really important. If you're not reading the rest of the brief and seeing how your work syncs with theirs, that's a mistake. So it's not just, I want you to do it. It's, I expect you to do it. It's actually talking about those expectations loudly and often so people understand, like, that's what good lawyering looks like to me.